I was halfway through my morning coffee when I saw Brenda Cunningham and 3 other HOA board members standing on my private pier, measuring tape in hand, looking like they owned the place. My name is Harrison O'Malley, and I had bought this waterfront property on Lake Norman, North Carolina 3 years ago, specifically because it came with deeded access to a private pier that extended 100 feet into the water. The previous owner had built it in 1987, long before the Lakeside Estates HOA even existed. The pier was explicitly excluded from the HOA covenants in my deed, a fact I had verified with 2 separate real estate attorneys before closing on the house. I set down my mug and walked out through my back door, crossing the perfectly manicured lawn that sloped down to the water's edge. The morning sun sparkled off the lake surface, and under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect Saturday. But watching Brenda tap notes into her phone while standing on my property made my blood pressure spike. "Morning, Brenda," I called out as I approached. "Mind telling me what you're doing on my pier?" She looked up with that particular expression she always wore, the one that suggested she was perpetually smelling something unpleasant. At 47, Brenda had made being HOA president her entire personality. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face, and she wore a crisp white polo shirt with the Lakeside Estates logo embroidered on it. "Harrison, good morning," she said in that saccharine tone that meant trouble. "We're just conducting a community amenity assessment. The board voted last Tuesday to designate this pier as a shared waterfront access point for the entire community." I felt my jaw clench. This is a private pier. It's not part of the HOA. Actually, Brenda pulled out a folder from her bag. According to our revised community covenants, all waterfront structures within the Lakeside Estates boundaries fall under HOA jurisdiction. This was unanimously approved by the board. I don't care what your board approved. My deed specifically excludes this pier from HOA control. It was built before the HOA existed. One of the other board members, a thin man named Gerald Thompson, stepped forward. The new covenants supersede previous arrangements. All residents agreed to be bound by board decisions when they purchased their homes. "That's not how property law works," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You can't just rewrite deeds through an HOA vote." Brenda's expression hardened. "We have a duty to provide equitable waterfront access to all residents. Your monopolization of this pier is unfair to the 83 other families who pay HOA dues but can't access the lake. Then the HOA should build its own pier. This one is mine." "Was yours," Brenda corrected. "Effective immediately, this pier is being seized under Community Betterment Clause 7.3. We'll be installing a sign and a reservation system by next weekend. Residents will be able to book 2-hour slots for fishing, swimming access, and boat mooring." I felt something hot and sharp spike through my chest. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious. And Harrison, if you interfere with community members using this amenity, you'll be fined $500 per incident." She smiled then, and it was the smile of someone who believed they held all the cards. "Have a wonderful day." They walked past me, Brenda's shoulder deliberately brushing mine. I stood there on my own pier, watching them disappear around the side of my house, and tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't just overreach. This was theft. I went back inside and immediately called my real estate attorney, Marcus Webb. He didn't answer, so I left an urgent voicemail explaining the situation. Then I pulled out my closing documents and spread them across my dining room table. There it was, clear as day in the property description. Private pier structure on northern boundary, constructed 1987, explicitly excluded from homeowner association governance, maintained and insured solely by property owner. The pier had been one of the main reasons I'd paid $650,000 for this house. I was an avid fisherman and had always dreamed of having my own dock. I'd spent thousands maintaining it, replacing rotted boards, reinforcing the pilings, and adding safety rails. The insurance alone cost me $3,000 a year through Coastal Property Insurance, a specialized carrier that covered waterfront structures. By Monday morning, I had an appointment scheduled with Marcus for Wednesday. But Tuesday brought a new nightmare. I walked outside to find a professionally printed sign installed at the entrance to my pier. "Lakeside Estates Community Waterfront Access Point. Please reserve your time slot through the HOA portal. Maximum occupancy, 12 persons, no glass containers, no overnight mooring. I tore the sign down immediately and carried it to my garage. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed with an email from the HOA. Bright. Dear Mr. O'Malley, you have been assessed a $500 fine for destruction of community property and interference with resident amenities. Payment is due within 30 days. Failure to pay will result in a lien being placed on your property. Additionally, you are in violation of community cooperation standards. A second violation will result in a $1,000 fine. Regards, Lakeside Estates HOA Board. I called Marcus immediately. This time he answered. Harrison, I got your voicemail. This is outrageous. They can't just seize your pier. They already have, I said, explaining the sign and the fine. Don't pay it, and don't sign anything they send you. I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter today. We'll threaten them with a lawsuit if they don't immediately back down. How strong is my case? Very strong. Your deed is explicit. HOAs have authority over common areas and reasonable restrictions on property use, but they can't unilaterally seize private property that was explicitly excluded from their jurisdiction. This is a clear overreach. Good. Send the letter. Marcus's cease and desist went out that afternoon via certified mail. I felt a small sense of relief. This would end soon. Brenda and her board would realize they'd made a mistake, and things would go back to normal. I was wrong. Wednesday morning, I woke up to find 4 people I didn't recognize sitting on my pier with fishing rods. They had a cooler, beach chairs, and a Bluetooth speaker playing country music. I walked down in my pajamas and bathrobe. Excuse me, this is private property, I said. A heavy-set man in his 60s looked up at me with confusion. No, it's not. The HOA sent an email blast yesterday saying the community pier was open. I reserved 8 to 10 a.m. This is my pier. It's not a community pier. That's not what the HOA said. He pulled out his phone and showed me an email. Sure enough, there was a message from Brenda announcing the exciting new Waterfront amenity and providing instructions for booking time slots through an online system. Look, I don't want to cause you trouble, I said, trying to remain calm, but the HOA doesn't own this pier. I do. They're lying to you. The man's wife stood up, looking concerned. We don't want any trouble. Brenda said this was available to all residents. Brenda is wrong, and I'm sorry you got caught in the middle of this, but you need to leave. They packed up their things, grumbling. As they left, the man said, We're going to report this to the board. You can't just hog the waterfront. An hour later, I received another email. Fine number 2, $500 for interfering with resident use of community amenities, and a warning that continued interference would result in legal action against me. My phone rang. It was Marcus. Harrison, I just got a response to our cease and desist. That was fast. They've retained Blackwell and Associates. It's a firm that specializes in HOA law. Their response is basically a middle finger. They're claiming the Community Betterment Clause gives them authority to designate underutilized private amenities as shared resources for the good of the community. That's insane. Can they actually argue that? They can argue anything. Whether they'll win is another matter. But Harrison, this is going to get expensive. Blackwell doesn't play around. They're going to drag this out and bury us in paperwork. I don't care. This is my property. I'm going to file for a temporary restraining order. We'll ask the court to prevent the HOA from allowing residents onto your pier until the ownership issue is resolved. Can you get me photographs of your deed, the pier, the sign they put up, everything? Absolutely. I spent the rest of Wednesday documenting everything. I took photos and videos, printed my deed and closing documents, and compiled 3 years of maintenance receipts and insurance statements for the pier. I wanted a record of everything I'd invested in this structure. Thursday morning brought another development. I found a padlock and chain wrapped around the gate that led from my backyard to the pier. There was a note zip tied to the chain. Due to resident complaints about harassment, access to this pier will be controlled by the HOA. Please contact the board office to receive your access code. You are allotted 3 2-hour reservation slots per week, same as other residents. I stood there staring at the lock, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. They'd actually locked me out of my own pier. I was being limited to 6 hours a week on a structure I owned and maintained. I called Marcus immediately and sent him photos. "This is good," he said. "Yeah, how is this good?" "Because they just made our case stronger. They're not just claiming shared access anymore. They're actively preventing you from using your own property. No judge is going to look favorably on that. I'm filing the TRO motion today. We should have a hearing within 2 weeks." But 2 weeks felt like an eternity. I watched from my windows as strangers traipsed back and forth to my pier using a gate code that I didn't have. They left trash. One family let their kids jump off the end despite the clear danger. A teenager tried to tie a jet ski to one of the cleats and nearly tore it out of the pier. I documented everything, every piece of trash, every safety violation, every bit of damage. I filed police reports for trespassing, though the officers who responded seemed confused by the HOA's involvement and declined to make arrests. "This is a civil matter, sir," one officer told me. "You'll need to resolve it through the courts." Friday evening, I was going through my mail when I found a letter from Coastal Property Insurance. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. Dear Mr. O'Malley, we are writing to inform you that your waterfront structure insurance policy will be canceled effective 30 days from the date of this letter. During our routine review, we became aware that your private pier has been designated as a community access point available to multiple parties. Our policy coverage is specifically for privately owned and used structures. The increased liability exposure created by public access is beyond the scope of your current policy. We cannot offer coverage for community use waterfront amenities. Additionally, due to this change in property use classification, we are conducting a portfolio review and will be canceling coverage for all Lakeside Estates waterfront properties. Please secure alternative coverage before your cancellation date. I read it 3 times. My insurance company was dropping me because of the HOA's seizure of my pier. And they weren't just dropping me, they were pulling out of the entire community. This was a disaster. Waterfront property insurance was expensive and hard to get. Most standard carriers wouldn't touch it. Coastal Property Insurance specialized in it, and most of my neighbors used them. If they pulled out of Lakeside Estates entirely, everyone would be scrambling for coverage. Premiums would skyrocket if people could even find alternative policies. And this was entirely Brenda's fault. I immediately forwarded the letter to Marcus, then sent a copy to the HOA board with a message. Your illegal seizure of my pier has caused our insurance carrier to drop coverage for the entire community. This is what happens when you overreach your authority. Return control of my pier immediately. The response came within an hour from Brenda personally. Mr. O'Malley, your continued attempts to monopolize community resources are now actively harming other residents. The board stands by its decision. If your insurance carrier has unreasonable policies, that is not the HOA's concern. You should have thought about the consequences before refusing to cooperate with the community. The pier remains a shared amenity. I wanted to throw my phone through the window. Instead, I called Marcus again. They just screwed everyone in the neighborhood, I said, explaining the insurance situation. Marcus was quiet for a moment. This actually might work in our favor. When the other residents find out that Brenda's power grab has jeopardized their insurance, there's going to be hell to pay. The board might face internal pressure to back down. Or they'll blame me. Possibly, but the facts are on your side. The HOA created this situation, not you. The weekend was tense. I stayed inside mostly, watching from my windows as residents used my pier. On Saturday afternoon, I saw a woman slip on the wet boards and nearly fall into the water. Her husband caught her, but it was close. None of these people understood the pier's quirks, the boards that were slicker than others, the section near the middle that had a slight give to it. Monday morning, I woke up to chaos. My phone had dozens of missed calls and text messages. The Lakeside Estates community Facebook group was on fire. The insurance cancellation letters had arrived for everyone, and people were panicking. Who's responsible for this? I can't afford to lose my waterfront coverage. This is going to destroy our property values. Someone needs to fix this immediately. And then Brenda posted, Dear residents, We have recently learned that Harrison O'Malley's refusal to cooperate with the Community Waterfront Access Initiative has caused our insurance carrier to reconsider coverage for our neighborhood. This is an unfortunate consequence of one resident putting his personal interests above the good of the community. The board is exploring legal options to compel Mr. O'Malley to comply with community standards. We will not allow one selfish individual to harm the rest of us. My phone started ringing immediately. Angry neighbors who I'd barely spoken to in 3 years were suddenly calling me every name in the book. Someone threw eggs at my front door. Another person left a note on my car. Stop being a selfish jerk. I didn't leave my house. I sent everything to Marcus and waited. Tuesday brought our TRO hearing. I met Marcus at the courthouse in downtown Charlotte, an hour drive from Lake Norman. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, and smelled like old paper. Brenda was there with 2 other board members and their attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Patricia Blackwell. Judge Catherine Morrison presided. She was in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked over our filings with a neutral expression. "All right, Mr. Webb, explain to me why I should grant a temporary restraining order." Marcus stood. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of property seizure. Mr. O'Malley purchased his home with a deeded pier that was explicitly excluded from HOA governance. The pier was built in 1987, before the HOA existed. Despite this, the HOA board has unilaterally declared the pier to be a community amenity, prevented Mr. O'Malley from accessing his own property, and threatened him with fines and legal action when he objected. This is a clear violation of his property rights." Judge Morrison turned to Patricia Blackwell. "Ms. Blackwell, what's the HOA's position?" Patricia stood smoothly. "Your Honor, this is not a seizure. This is a reasonable exercise of HOA authority under the community betterment provisions of the covenants. Mr. O'Malley agreed to be bound by HOA decisions when he purchased his property. The board determined that exclusive private use of the only waterfront access point in a community of 84 homes was inequitable and contrary to community interests. The board's designation of shared access is a legitimate exercise of their authority to promote the welfare of all residents. Even for property explicitly excluded from their jurisdiction?" the judge asked. "Your Honor, the exclusion language in Mr. O'Malley's deed pertains to maintenance obligations, not usage restrictions. The HOA is not claiming to own the pier. We're simply regulating its use in accordance with community standards." Judge Morrison looked at the deed documents. "The language says, excluded from homeowner association governance. That seems pretty clear to me." "It's ambiguous at best," Patricia argued, "and ambiguities in covenants are resolved in favor of community interest." "Not when they conflict with explicit deed language," Marcus countered. "And Your Honor, I'd like to note that the HOA's actions have caused substantial harm. They've locked Mr. O'Malley out of his own property, limited him to 6 hours per week of access, and their seizure has caused his insurance carrier to drop coverage not just for him, but for the entire community. This is causing irreparable harm." Judge Morrison removed her glasses. "Ms. Blackwell, do you deny that the HOA has installed locks preventing Mr. O'Malley from accessing the pier?" "We installed access controls for safety and scheduling purposes, Your Honor. Mr. O'Malley has the same access as any other resident. But it's his pier. That's in dispute, Your Honor." Judge Morrison sighed. "No, it's really not. I've reviewed the deed and the language is explicit. The pier is Mr. O'Malley's private property, excluded from HOA governance. The fact that the HOA board voted to seize it doesn't make that seizure legal. I'm granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA is prohibited from preventing Mr. O'Malley's access to his pier, from allowing other residents onto the pier without his permission, and from imposing fines related to the pier. This order is effective immediately and will remain in place pending a full hearing on the merits." I felt relief flood through me. "Your Honor," Patricia said quickly, "we request a stay of that order pending appeal." "Denied. Remove the locks today, Ms. Blackwell. This hearing is adjourned." We walked out of the courthouse into bright sunshine. Marcus was grinning. That was as clean a win as we could hope for. Judge Morrison saw right through their argument. "So it's over?" The TRO is in place, which is huge, but they'll probably appeal, and we'll still need the full hearing to make this permanent. But Harrison, you won the first round decisively. I drove home, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. When I arrived, I found Brenda standing in my driveway with Gerald Thompson and another board member. "The judge ruled against you," I said. "Remove your locks from my pier." Brenda's face was flushed red. "This isn't over. We're appealing." "Appeal all you want. Until then, stay off my property." "You're destroying this community," she said, her voice rising. "Do you understand what you've done? Everyone's losing their insurance because of your selfishness." "Everyone's losing their insurance because you illegally seized my property," I shot back. "If you'd respected my property rights in the first place, none of this would have happened. This is entirely your fault. We were trying to create equity. By stealing from me? That's not equity. That's theft." Gerald stepped forward. "Harrison, please. Can't we find a compromise? Maybe you could allow limited access and we could help with maintenance costs. If you'd approached me respectfully and asked, maybe we could have worked something out. But you didn't ask. You seized my property, locked me out, and threatened me with fines. You burned that bridge. Now get off my driveway." They left and I walked down to the pier. The lock was still there. I called Marcus, who called Patricia Blackwell. Within an hour, Gerald returned with bolt cutters and removed the lock without a word. I stood on my pier that evening, watching the sunset paint the water orange and gold, and tried to enjoy the moment. But the victory felt hollow. My insurance was still canceled, and I had no idea how I was going to replace it. The next morning, I started calling Waterfront insurance carriers. The first 3 wouldn't even give me a quote once they heard the address. The fourth, a small regional company called Atlantic Coastal Coverage, said they could offer coverage but at nearly triple what I'd been paying, $8,000 a year. "Why so high?" I asked the agent, a man named Richard Paulson. "Frankly, Mr. O'Malley, the whole situation with your HOA has red-flagged your community. We see HOA disputes as high risk. There's litigation potential, unclear liability, and property access issues. That all translates to higher premiums." I had no choice. I accepted the coverage, but I made sure to document the increased cost and sent the invoice to Marcus. This was another element of damages caused by the HOA's actions. The community Facebook group was still ablaze. Most residents had received similar news from other insurance carriers. Some couldn't find coverage at all. Property values were likely to tank if people couldn't insure their waterfront homes. And the anger was increasingly directed at the HOA board. A petition appeared calling for a special election to remove the board. It gathered signatures quickly. People were posting screenshots of the judge's ruling, showing that Brenda had illegally seized my pier. The narrative was shifting. Then, Brenda made her biggest mistake. She posted a long message in the Facebook group doubling down. She claimed the judge's ruling was temporary and would be overturned. She insisted the pier would remain a community amenity and that I was weaponizing the legal system against my own neighbors. She ended with, "We will not be bullied by one wealthy property owner who thinks he's above the rules." The post backfired spectacularly. Residents who had been on the fence turned against her. People pointed out that I was following the rules, that my deed explicitly gave me rights to the pier, and that Brenda was the one who had caused the insurance crisis through her overreach. Within 48 hours, the petition for a special election had enough signatures to force a vote. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community clubhouse. I debated whether to attend. Part of me wanted to stay home and let the residents sort it out, but another part wanted to face Brenda and the board directly. I'd been painted as a villain for weeks. Maybe it was time to defend myself publicly. Saturday came, and the clubhouse was packed. Every chair was full, and people lined the walls. I arrived early and sat in the back. The energy in the room was tense. Brenda called the meeting to order. She looked tired, her hair not quite as perfectly styled as usual. She launched into a prepared statement about the board's dedication to community welfare and equitable access to amenities. "We have always acted in good faith," she said. "Our goal was to ensure that all residents, not just those fortunate enough to own waterfront property, could enjoy the lake. Mr. O'Malley's refusal to share what should be a community resource has cost all of us dearly." A man in the third row stood up. I recognized him as Dennis Walker, a retired engineer who lived 4 houses down from me. "Brenda, cut the crap. You seized Harrison's private property without legal authority. The judge said so. And because of your overreach, my insurance premium tripled. My wife and I are considering selling because we can't afford it. You didn't create equity. You created a disaster." Applause erupted. Brenda's face turned red. "Mr. Walker, your insurance issues are not the board's fault. We can't control corporate decisions." Another woman stood up. "Yes, you can. The insurance company explicitly said they dropped us because you turned a private pier into a public amenity. That's liability they won't cover. This is directly your fault." More applause. Brenda tried to regain control, but the room was turning against her. Person after person stood up to criticize the board's decision. Some people defended me directly, saying I'd done nothing wrong by protecting my property rights. Then an older man stood up. I didn't recognize him. He was thin, with white hair and a weathered face. "My name is Robert Davidson. I'm the person who built that pier in 1987. I owned Harrison's house before I sold it to the Millers, who eventually sold it to Harrison. When I built that pier, there was no HOA. This was just a neighborhood. I specifically excluded the pier from the HOA when it was formed in 1992 because I built it with my own money and I didn't want the HOA controlling it. I made sure that exclusion was written into the deed." "Brenda, what you've done is not just illegal. It's an insult to everyone who respects property rights. You should resign." The room erupted in applause. Brenda looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. "This is a witch hunt," she shouted over the noise. "You're all turning on us because one person manipulated you." "The judge said you were wrong," someone yelled back. "We're appealing." "Then you're wasting HOA money on a losing case." The special election was held immediately. Ballots were distributed. The question was simple: remove the current board and hold immediate elections for replacements? The vote was 71-9 in favor of removal. Brenda, Gerald, and the other board members were out. Temporary replacements were elected on the spot. Dennis Walker became interim president. One of his first acts was to make a motion formally acknowledging that my pier was private property and apologizing for the board's overreach. The motion passed unanimously. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to apologize for the angry calls and messages. I accepted their apologies, understanding they'd been manipulated by Brenda's narrative. Robert Davidson shook my hand. "I'm sorry you had to go through this, son. I'm glad the pier's in good hands." "Thank you for speaking up," I said. "It meant a lot." I went home feeling vindicated. The community had spoken, but the legal issues weren't over. The insurance problem was still real, and I later learned that Brenda was still pushing Patricia Blackwell to file an appeal. Then something unexpected happened. 3 days after the special election, I received a call from Richard Paulson at Atlantic Coastal Coverage. "Mr. O'Malley, I wanted to give you an update. We've been in contact with Coastal Property Insurance regarding the Lakeside Estate situation. Now that the HOA has formally recognized your pier as private property and the previous board has been removed, Coastal is reconsidering their cancellation. They're willing to reinstate coverage for the community, including your pier, at the original rates." Relief washed over me. That's incredible news. It gets better. Since we already issued your policy, we're bound by the contract. But given these developments, we're willing to cancel your policy with us without penalty, so you can return to Coastal if you prefer. No hard feelings. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Within a week, my original insurance was reinstated. The same happened for the rest of the community. Property values stabilized. The crisis was over. But Brenda wasn't done. Patricia Blackwell filed an appeal of Judge Morrison's TRO, arguing that the removal of the board didn't affect the legal merits of the case. The appeal was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Marcus was confident. "They're going to lose. The deed language is explicit, and we now have the HOA itself acknowledging your rights. But they're burning through money on legal fees. Someone's going to have to pay for that. Can we go after Brenda personally? Potentially. If we can show she acted in bad faith or outside her authority, she might be personally liable. But that's a separate lawsuit." I thought about it. Part of me wanted to make Brenda pay for what she'd put me through, but another part just wanted it to be over. I'd already spent thousands on legal fees and lost countless hours of sleep. Let's focus on winning the appeal first, I said. Then we'll decide. The appeal hearing was held on a Thursday morning in early November. The weather had turned cold, and the trees around Lake Norman were ablaze with fall colors. I drove to Charlotte with Marcus feeling strangely calm. We'd done everything right. The facts were on our side. The appellate panel consisted of 3 judges. They'd reviewed all the briefs in advance, so the hearing was shorter than the original TRO hearing. Patricia Blackwell made essentially the same arguments, emphasizing the HOA's authority to promote community welfare and claiming the deed language was ambiguous. Marcus countered with the explicit deed language, the fact that the Pier predated the HOA, and the fact that even the HOA itself had now acknowledged my property rights. He also emphasized the harm caused by the seizure, the insurance cancellation, the emotional distress, and the financial costs. The lead judge, a man named Judge Franklin Pierce, asked Patricia a direct question. Counselor, if the HOA doesn't claim to own the Pier, on what legal basis can they restrict the owner's access to his own property? Patricia paused. Your Honor, the HOA has broad authority to regulate property use within the community for the benefit of all residents. But this property was explicitly excluded from HOA governance. Doesn't that exclusion mean anything? We interpret that exclusion narrowly, Your Honor, as pertaining to maintenance obligations rather than use restrictions. That seems like a stretch, Judge Pierce said dryly, and it seems to ignore the plain language of the deed. 2 weeks later, the ruling came down. The appellate court upheld Judge Morrison's TRO and made it permanent. The decision was scathing. The HOA's interpretation of its authority is not only incorrect but dangerous, Judge Pierce wrote in the opinion. HOAs serve important functions in maintaining community standards, but they are not entitled to seize private property simply because they believe shared access would be more equitable. Property rights are fundamental, and deed language must be respected. The lower court's ruling is affirmed in its entirety. The HOA is permanently enjoined from interfering with Mr. O'Malley's use of his Pier. It was over. I'd won completely. Marcus called me with the news. Harrison, congratulations. This is a total victory. They can't touch your Pier ever again. Can we go after them for costs? Absolutely. We're going to file for attorney's fees and damages. You're entitled to recover everything you spent defending your property rights. Over the next month, we compiled a detailed accounting. Legal fees, increased insurance costs, time off work for court appearances, even the cost of replacing the lock they'd installed. The total came to $43,000. We filed the motion, and the new HOA board didn't contest it. Dennis Walker called me personally. Harrison, the board is going to pay your costs. We reviewed the previous board's actions, and they were clearly improper. You shouldn't have to bear the financial burden of their mistakes. Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate that. I also want to formally invite you to join the new board. We could use someone who understands property rights and isn't afraid to stand up to overreach. I considered it. Part of me wanted nothing to do with the HOA ever again. But another part recognized that I was now in a position to ensure this kind of abuse never happened again. Let me think about it, I said. The HOA paid the $43,000 in full just before Christmas. I put it toward a new boat, a 22-foot fishing vessel that I moored at my private pier. But the story wasn't quite finished. In January, I received a call from a process server. Patricia Blackwell had filed a lawsuit against the HOA for unpaid legal fees. Apparently, the previous board had racked up nearly $70,000 in legal bills fighting me, and the new board was refusing to pay. They hired us without proper authorization, Patricia's complaint alleged, and they pursued frivolous litigation against a homeowner with clear legal rights. We fulfilled our contractual obligations and are entitled to payment. Dennis called me in a panic. Harrison, if we have to pay Blackwell, it's going to bankrupt the HOA. We'll have to levy a special assessment on every homeowner. People are going to lose their minds. What are your options? Our attorney says we might be able to hold Brenda and the previous board personally liable since they acted outside their authority, but that would mean suing them individually. I thought about Brenda. She'd caused all this chaos through her arrogance and overreach. She'd made my life hell for months, cost me thousands of dollars, and nearly destroyed the community's insurance coverage. Did I feel bad about her potentially facing personal liability? Not really. Do what you need to do, I told Dennis. If Brenda has to face consequences for her actions, that's on her. The HOA filed a counterclaim against Brenda, Gerald, and the other removed board members, arguing they had hired Patricia Blackwell without proper authorization and pursued litigation that was clearly doomed to fail. The HOA sought to hold them personally responsible for the legal fees. It was ugly. Brenda hired her own attorney and fought back, claiming she'd acted in good faith and within her authority as board president. But the evidence was damning. The original board had never taken a formal vote to authorize the litigation. Brenda had essentially hired Patricia unilaterally and committed HOA funds without board approval. The case settled in March. Brenda, Gerald, and the other former board members agreed to personally pay $35,000 toward Patricia Blackwell's fees. The HOA covered the remaining $35,000 through reserves, avoiding a special assessment. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Brenda and her husband put their house up for sale. They moved out in April, and I never saw her again. By summer, life had returned to normal. I spent countless hours on my pier, fishing in the early mornings and evenings. I invited neighbors out occasionally on my terms, and several became good friends. The community had learned a hard lesson about respecting property rights, and the new board operated with much more transparency and restraint. One warm evening in June, I was sitting on my pier watching the sunset when Dennis walked down. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Not at all." He sat down, dangling his feet over the edge. "You know, I've been thinking about everything that happened. Brenda really believed she was doing the right thing. She convinced herself that seizing your pier was about fairness and community. She couldn't see that it was just theft." "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," I said. "Exactly. And I think that's the real danger with HOAs. You get people who mean well, but who start thinking the community interest trumps individual rights. They forget that we're all individuals first. The community is just a collection of us. And if you violate one person's rights for the supposed good of the group, you're not creating equity. You're creating tyranny." "That's surprisingly philosophical for a Thursday evening." Dennis laughed. "I've had a lot of time to think about it. Being board president has been educational. You see how much power an HOA has and how easy it would be to abuse it. We have to be constantly vigilant." "Speaking of which, I've decided to accept your invitation. I'll join the board." Dennis's face lit up. "Really? That's fantastic." "On one condition. We implement strict policies about property rights, clear limits on HOA authority, no more seizures, no more overreach. If someone's property is excluded from HOA governance, that exclusion is absolute and binding." "Done. I'll put it on the agenda for next month's meeting." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Across the lake, boats were returning to their docks, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the call of a loon. My phone buzzed. It was an email from my insurance company confirming my renewal for another year at the original rate. Everything had come full circle. I thought about Robert Davidson, the man who had built this pier nearly 40 years ago. He'd had the foresight to protect it from HOA control, understanding that property rights needed explicit protection. He'd given me an incredible gift, and I'd fought to preserve it. Now it was my turn to ensure that kind of overreach never happened again, not just to me but to anyone in the community. As a board member, I'd have the ability to shape policies and prevent future Brendas from abusing their authority. The pier gently rocked beneath me as a boat passed in the distance, its wake rolling across the water. This structure had been the source of so much conflict, but it was also my refuge, my connection to the lake, and a symbol of the importance of standing up for what was right. I'd bought this house for the pier, and I'd fought to keep it. Now, sitting here in the gathering darkness, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just because I'd won, but because I'd defended a principle that mattered. Property rights weren't just abstract legal concepts. They were the foundation of freedom and individual autonomy. Brenda had tried to take that away in the name of equity and community welfare. She'd failed. And in failing, she'd taught the entire community a valuable lesson about the limits of collective authority and the enduring importance of individual rights. Dennis eventually left, and I stayed on the pier until full dark. The stars emerged one by one, reflecting on the still water. Somewhere out on the lake, fish were feeding, and I made a mental note to wake up early for some dawn fishing. As I walked back to my house, I glanced back at the pier one more time. It was mine. Fully, completely, legally mine. And it always would be. The next morning, I woke at 5:30 and made coffee. The lake was shrouded in mist and the air was cool and damp. I grabbed my fishing gear and headed down to the pier, relishing the solitude. I was casting my line when I heard footsteps. I turned to see a young couple I didn't recognize walking down from the direction of my house. "Morning," the man called out. "We just moved in 2 streets over. Someone told us there was community pier access here." I felt my jaw tighten, but then I noticed their confused expressions. They were new. They didn't know the history. "Actually, this is a private pier," I said calmly. "The HOA tried to claim it was a community amenity last year, but that got sorted out. It's just mine." The woman looked embarrassed. "Oh, we're so sorry. Someone in the neighborhood Facebook group must have had old information. We didn't mean to intrude." "No harm done. But hey, since you're here, there's actually a public access point about a half-mile down the shore. The county maintains it. You can fish and launch kayaks there. It's a nice spot." "Thank you. We'll check it out. Sorry again." They left, and I returned to my fishing. The sun was rising, burning off the mist, and the water was beginning to shimmer. I caught 3 bass in the next hour, releasing each one after a quick photo. My phone buzzed around 8. It was Marcus. "Harrison, good morning. I wanted to let you know that the judgment for your costs has been satisfied. The check cleared. You're officially whole again." "That's great news, Marcus. Thank you for everything." "My pleasure. It was a good case, clean facts, and a satisfying outcome. Those don't come around as often as you'd think. If you ever need anything else, don't hesitate to call." After we hung up, I sat on the pier and thought about the entire ordeal. From the moment I'd seen Brenda measuring my pier to the final settlement payment, it had been nearly 9 months of stress, conflict, and uncertainty. But I'd persevered, and I'd won. More importantly, the community had learned from the experience. The new board was operating with transparency and restraint. Property rights were being respected, and residents were more engaged, paying attention to HOA decisions rather than rubber stamping whatever the board proposed. In a strange way, Brenda had done us all a favor. Her overreach had been so egregious that it sparked a reckoning. The community had confronted the dangers of unchecked HOA authority and had made changes to prevent future abuses. I joined the HOA board in July, as promised. My first initiative was drafting a property rights protection policy that explicitly limited HOA authority over private property. The policy established clear procedures for any board action that might affect individual property rights, including mandatory legal review and owner notification. The policy passed unanimously, and Dennis framed a copy for the community clubhouse. It hung on the wall near the entrance, a reminder of what we'd learned. Over the following months, I discovered that I actually enjoyed the board work. It was satisfying to help shape community decisions in a fair and balanced way. I advocated for reasonable rules that maintain property values and community aesthetics without infringing on individual freedom. In October, we had our first real test. A homeowner wanted to install a large workshop building in his backyard. The structure technically violated the size restrictions in the covenants. Under the old board, they probably would have just denied it. But we took a different approach. We invited the homeowner to present his plans at a board meeting. He explained that he was a woodworker and needed the space for his business. The building would be well constructed, professionally designed, and set back far from neighboring properties. We discussed it, considered the impact on surrounding homes, and granted a variance with conditions about the building's appearance and noise levels. The homeowner was thrilled, and the neighbors didn't object. It was a win-win, the kind of reasonable governance that HOAs should provide. By the time winter rolled around, Lakeside Estates felt like a different community. There was more trust, more communication, and less fear of arbitrary board action. People were proud to live there again. I spent Thanksgiving on my pier, despite the cold. I bundled up in layers and sat with a thermos of coffee, watching ducks paddle by. I thought about everything I had to be grateful for. The pier, of course, but also the principle I'd defended, the community I'd helped reshape, and the lesson that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, is always worth it. As December arrived and the year drew to a close, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Brenda. Dear Harrison, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to reach out to apologize for everything that happened last year. I've had a lot of time to reflect on my actions, and I recognize now that I was wrong. I convinced myself that I was promoting fairness and community welfare, but in reality, I was violating your rights and causing tremendous harm. I let my position as board president go to my head. I stopped listening to reason and became fixated on winning rather than doing what was right. The consequences of my actions have been severe, both for you and for my own family. My husband and I had to sell our home to help pay the legal settlement, and we've moved to a smaller place outside Charlotte. Our relationships with many former neighbors are damaged, perhaps irreparably. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong, and I am truly sorry. I hope you're enjoying your pier and that the community is healed from the conflict I created. Sincerely, Brenda Cunningham. I read the letter twice, trying to gauge its sincerity. It seemed genuine. Brenda had lost a lot through her actions, her home, her position, her reputation, and a significant amount of money. Those consequences had apparently prompted real reflection and growth. I considered responding but ultimately decided not to. Some wounds heal best with distance and time. Brenda's apology was noted, and I hoped she'd learned from the experience. But I didn't need to engage with her further. That chapter was closed. Instead, I folded the letter and filed it away. Then I went down to my pier one last time before the year ended. The lake was quiet, the water dark and cold. Ice was beginning to form along the edges of the shore. It would be a few months before I could fish here again in comfort. But the pier was still mine. It would be mine next spring when the ice melted, next summer when the lake warmed, and next fall when the trees blazed with color. It would be mine for as long as I owned this house, protected by deed language, court rulings, and a community that had learned the hard way about respecting property rights. I stood there as the sun set, casting long shadows across the water, and felt a profound sense of peace. The fight had been exhausting and expensive, but it had been worth every moment. I'd defended something important, not just for myself, but for anyone who might face similar overreach in the future. The pier creaked gently beneath my feet, solid and enduring. This structure had stood here for nearly 40 years, surviving storms, seasons, and now an attempted seizure by an overreaching HOA. It would stand for years to come, a testament to the importance of standing firm when your rights are threatened. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, I walked back to my house, already looking forward to spring and the return of warm weather and good fishing. The ordeal was over. The pier was mine. And life on Lake Norman was exactly what I'd hoped it would be when I first bought this property 3 years ago. Everything had come full circle. The insurance was restored. The community was thriving under new leadership. The legal battles were won. And I had a freezer full of bass fillets from a summer of excellent fishing. Sometimes standing up for what's right requires sacrifice, conflict, and persistence. But in the end, principle matters. Property rights matter, and the willingness to defend them even against institutional pressure and community criticism is what separates a free society from one where the collective can simply vote away individual liberty. Brenda had learned that lesson the hard way. The community had learned it too, and I'd been reminded of why it matters so much to fight for what you believe in, even when the odds seem stacked against you. The pier was mine. It had always been mine. And now, thanks to clear court rulings and a reformed HOA, it would remain mine forever. That was worth celebrating. I poured myself a whiskey that night and toasted to property rights, to good attorneys like Marcus, to reformed communities, and to private piers on beautiful lakes. Then, I started planning my fishing trips for the coming year, already excited about the possibilities. The nightmare was over. Life was good. And my pier, my beautiful private pier, stood ready for whatever adventures the future might bring.